You're listening to the Doc Lounge podcast. This is a place for candid conversations with the healthcare industry's top physicians, executives, and thought leaders. This podcast is made possible by Pacific Companies, your trusted advisor in physician recruitment. I am one of your hosts, Cameron Steinheimer, and I am the marketing manager here at Pacific Companies.
Hello and welcome to the Doc Lounge podcast by Pacific Companies. I'm your host, Stacey Doyle, Senior Director of Marketing. We want to thank you for tuning in today for our Provider's Perspective series. This series focuses on a physician's journey through medicine and their learnings and advice that they would give to, their peers and any upcoming physicians. Our special guest today on the Provider's Perspective is Dr. Brandi Jackson, an Inpatient Psychiatric Medical Director. I'm also joined by my co-host today, Ryan Calso. He is the Director of Permanent Physician Recruitment at Pacific Companies. So first, I want to welcome Dr. Jackson. We are so excited to have you with us today. Would love to just give you a minute to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and how you got into psychiatry.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me, first of all. I am actually originally from a small town in Northeast Ohio, and I grew up in a pretty close-knit community. So I became a doctor to serve communities, and I still consider myself a community psychiatrist. Although now I see people from all over the country. I'm mostly focused in inner city areas. I did most of my medical training in Chicago. And more recently, with help of Ryan, I've moved to the Milwaukee area and I'm working at a hospital there, helping to establish what is one of the largest referral centers for the county of Milwaukee for psychiatric care.
Amazing. Well, that is such an impressive background. We're lucky to have you today. And I want to go ahead and that leads into the intro to Ryan. Ryan, tell us a little bit about, your background and as a physician recruiter, and you've been working with Dr. Jackson recently.
Yeah, so I've been in physician recruiting for the better half of a decade here, and just kind of fell into this role. I was actually solicited on LinkedIn, and at first I was like, I don't know what that is. I don't think I'm going to do that. 6 months later, I found myself interviewing. I was like, I think I could be pretty good at this, and here we are, half a decade later, and a little over half a decade now, and recruited physicians all over the nation and absolutely love what I do, making a difference here. But, as a physician recruiter, we travel around the nation to these different healthcare systems, such as this one in Milwaukee that Dr. Jackson is talking about. We consult with their CEOs, any board members or decision makers, look over contracts, processes, and really help find them stellar providers like Dr. Jackson to make that difference, because as we know, we're about 120,000 physicians short, especially on the mental health side of things, which we'll get into today, and it's only going to grow. So my experience working with Dr. Jackson, the reason why I wanted her on the show is because she has been my favorite candidate to work with thus far. She has the best personality ever. You'd never think an inpatient psychiatric medical director would have the personality that she does. No offense to other psych medical directors, but she's awesome. So really excited to have her on the show and share some of her experience.
Love it. Well, thank you for that intro and background about yourself, Ryan. I would just love to learn a little bit more, Dr. Jackson. Why did you originally kind of get into psychiatry, and what really inspired you to pursue this career?
Well, when I entered medical school, I was pretty sure I was going to be a family medicine physician. That was my goal. But then in medical school, you basically rotate through every specialty of medicine. And I found myself really loving to get to know the social lives of my patient and kind of get into their minds more than I cared about the liver numbers and even like what their heart sounded like. I cared about what was going through their hearts and their minds. And so I kind of decided toward the end of medical school to pick this specialty, and I haven't looked back.
That's really inspiring. And it's cool that you knew you had the calling, and it said, okay, this is my path. This is where I want to go. And that kind of leads me to thinking, how did you end up then deciding, okay, now I want to kind of focus a little bit more on leadership and become, a director role?
That's a wonderful question. I think in hindsight, I always had this interest in leadership. But every time throughout my life and throughout my education that I've taken on any kind of leadership role, it's been pretty reluctantly. It's because I look around and I say, okay, no one really wants to be the student council lead. Okay, I'll do it. I was like the default. And I think things really changed for me. I was a chief resident, which is a key leadership position in psychiatry training. And I really enjoyed pretty much all aspects of that, and working closely to bridge administration with the folks who are on the front line of the work. I always like that. But it was really the pandemic and watching a lot of infrastructure be lost and broken down that caused me to really decide that it was time to step forward, probably decades earlier than I originally envisioned, into more of a leadership role and eventually an executive leadership role. And it's been pretty rewarding.
Yeah, I know the pandemic and with COVID, that really just brought to the forefront the needs and really, kind of the lack of providers that we have and really, just that there is a mental health, crisis around our country, and just that the awareness around it wasn't really that high until we, were kind of entered into the pandemic, and then obviously post the pandemic. So I'd love to learn, from you, obviously an expert in the field, really kind of how you have seen that evolve and where you think it's going.
Thanks for the question. I'm relatively new out of residency, although I do feel like the pandemic and leading through the pandemic has definitely added some invisible years to my experience. For me, there was always this feeling that I could look to physicians who had been in practice much longer to kind of hold these senior positions, leadership positions, and really show those of us who were a little closer to training kind of the way. And the pandemic caused a lot of stress on the mental health professionals, all of us, not just the physicians, of course, and mental health nurse practitioners, social workers. And a lot of folks have chosen to leave the profession altogether or to find, other ways to practice healing. And so one day I looked up and realized that there were all these empty seats of leadership. And it's that cliche about realizing that you are the person, you are the one who can step forward, no matter how imperfect you may feel or how much there is to learn. And so I've been really lucky to be surrounded by some great mentors in the leadership space that have made it a little bit easier. But for sure, we're in uncharted territory when it comes to the field of mental health, especially public mental health.
I'd say you're a pretty good default choice, starting from the beginning to now, Dr. Jackson.
I appreciate that. I try to feel that, but it's definitely a challenge every day to make sure that we're leading the public health of really people all across America in the right direction. So I know a lot of leaders, we are doing our best, but it's a tough time.
Yeah, and I think that's interesting. A lot of times until you're kind of put at that point where, okay, should I raise my hand? Am I qualified? Obviously you are, qualified and you have a passion for it. So is there something that kind of advice you would give to some of our, physicians that are listening about that?
I would say to feel the fear and do it anyway. One of the things that's great about meeting Ryan and working with Ryan is that he really opened my eyes to all the different opportunities that are out there for folks who are willing to step forward into leadership positions. We always need psychiatrists and who want to just see patients, so to speak. I hate to say just, because it is a lift in and of itself. But I have been surprised how open different organizations are, public and private, to really new types of leaders. So for me, I'm a Black woman. I believe something like 3% of psychiatrists are Black in general, let alone in the leadership space. I couldn't say. So at times it can feel a little bit peerless. So I know when I find allies and mentors and people who are willing to help open those doors, which I agree are well earned, but still sometimes those doors don't always open. It's a privilege, it's an honor, and it allows me to bring a new perspective to leadership. And I hope other people will follow and bring their unique lenses to the work.
That's great. I mean, that I think is really inspiring, and, want to, just congratulate you. I know, yeah, when you sometimes look around and go, wait, are there other people like that, like me, and how can we lift everybody up together? So question for you, I'd love just to learn a day in the life of as you as a medical director, psychiatric medical director. Tell us a little bit more about that.
I can tell you literally about the day that I had today. I woke up, I met with one of our new psychiatrists who just joined the team, and we divided up the patients for the day, who is going to see whom. I had a sidebar where I was in court testifying on behalf of a patient who was there involuntarily and giving expert testimony. And then I got to meet with some of the public defenders that work with my patients. And then I ran and saw patients and discharged some and admitted some, and then got to come back to the table and meet with the other executives about opening new wings of the hospital. So it's literally this sort of weaving between being a clinician and working closely with nurses and social workers and working with other executives to figure out how we're going to build on our services and do more. So it's really exciting.
That does sound really exciting. And every day it's different, I'm sure, from what you just described. I mean, that's pretty cool to be able to kind of have all those different touch points. How do you balance, making sure that you are ensuring that, high quality patient care, is being consistent within your department, and then all the kind of the admin aspects, is there a way you balance that?
Well, first, I allow myself to recognize that there's never 100% balance. Some days I'm more wearing my clinician hat necessarily, and other times I'm wearing that leadership hat. But I think for me, it all begins with people. It begins and ends with people, making sure you bring in the right team around you and listening to their expertise. So recruitment is truly, I'm not just saying that, it really is number one. And I think the other piece is grace, and realizing that every single person on both sides, your patients and your colleagues, are human beings all striving for this thing that we strive for perfection every day, and we give ourselves grace when we don't reach it, because it's quite impossible to actually reach perfection. But I try to find beauty in the striving. I try to remind myself to clock out. If you saw behind me, where in the part of my home where I have a little yoga mat and quiet space, because I think creating space for solitude is really important, and water and all the basics, and realizing that it's a marathon, never a sprint.
That's so well said. And I think burnout, is such a topic that is starting to become, at least we're talking about it more, and really prioritizing self-care. And that's exactly what you just said. You're prioritizing it for yourself and for your team, which I think is really important. I'd love to hear from both of you, from your perspective, obviously, as, a doctor and medical director, and then from Ryan's perspective, because I know he is, an advocate and very much in this space about mental health awareness. Just kind of, what do you think people should know out there? Just, we have some, just laymen in our audience that also listen that aren't, on the medical side. Tell us a little bit more about, what you'd like to get out there from a messaging standpoint.
I think for me, especially the helpers out there can sometimes forget that self-compassion piece. But I try to remind myself that you can only offer the compassion to others that you've cultivated for yourself, that you can only offer the space to others that you've given to yourself, and the peace that you've given to yourself. So I think if I could, urge everyone never to think of taking time for yourself as a selfish act. And it is actually the only way that you can continue to give and show up in your fullness.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. That's for sure. From personal experience and watching other people go through it, you definitely have to find a way to, meditate. And people think of meditating like the cross your legs Buddhist style, but that's not always what it means. It could be laying down for 10 minutes. It could be breathing exercises. It could be going to the gym. It could be having a heart-to-heart conversation with somebody. It could be whatever you need it to be, whatever centers you and brings you back to yourself and kind of puts you in that fluid state. One thing I do want a lot of people to be aware of is that you're not the only ones. About 33% of adults in June of 2022 were reported symptoms of depression and anxiety. There's a massive shortage of psychiatrists right now. So I think we're going to see a massive shift move more towards delegation from doctors like Dr. Jackson to psychiatric mental health nurse practitioners and these different AI and telehealth platforms. So, what we're seeing right now is we're actually seeing an increase of people applying for psychiatry residency. But one of the faults, I think, in our system is that the slots don't exist. So, it's been really challenging in that fact because it's risen 21% in recent years, but there's usually twice as many applicants as slots for them. So we're going to continue seeing that shift. You don't need a doctor to diagnose and prescribe. They all have communication with the doctor, some sort of delegation and hierarchy there, and they're just as good at their job as the doctors are. So try to get the help you need, be open about it, talk about it, and otherwise I think we're in for an even ruder awakening, so to speak, in the coming years, because right now about 60% of psychiatrists are 55 and older, and COVID really exacerbated a retirement movement, and more coming.
Interesting. Yeah, I did those stats are really, that kind of makes you really aware of the situation and what we have to face moving forward. And Ryan, that was really insightful on the residency side as well. Some good stats there and information. What do you, Dr. Jackson, do you think, with these telehealth platforms and telepsychiatry, is that something that you're seeing more, or is that, for a lot of what you're talking about, it's more, I'm assuming in person?
Yes. I definitely see a rise in psychiatrists working on the telehealth platforms. And even compared to just a few years ago, looking at the job market, there's so many postings for folks like me to be able to work and see patients without ever leaving our homes. I think the people, and I think that's great. So I think that's a wonderful thing, and it expands access. But I fear that the people who are left behind are those who are sick enough to require inpatient hospitalization, like the folks that I take care of, many of whom are experiencing very severe symptoms. And a lot of the diagnosis relies on being able to be in the physical environment of somebody who may not be able to communicate as effectively what they're feeling inside. So you are left to draw on their behaviors. How do they get along with other people in the unit? How do they ask for things? What kind of sleep are they having? And that gets lost on a telehealth platform. But what Ryan said is true, that the numbers are real. And so I think as a field, psychiatry is being called to level up, to really think hard about how psychiatrists are placed and used within organizations. How can we support the advancement of psychiatric nurse practitioners? We do use them in our hospital. They're wonderful. I enjoy working with psychiatric nurse practitioners. My job would not be possible without their assistance. And I think we're going to see more of that going forward.
Stacy, I want to ask a follow-up question to this, because I'm genuinely curious. Dr. Jackson, do you have any ideas, or what do you think we're going to see, to your point, for those really acute or sick patients, that aren't just struggling from minor, I shouldn't say minor, but, your day-to-day, general depression, general anxiety, that's typically easier to diagnose, and there's a lot more tools and resources available to those people. How do you see this shift, impacting your type of role, or, those even sicker patients? What needs to be done to help those patients?
I think it's such a great question. I think, first of all, that psychiatry is going to be forced to stratify its offerings. In other words, that the people who can benefit from AI interventions, perhaps people who are experiencing more mild symptoms, maybe they just need a little bit of skills training, those folks will probably end up using the newer apps and the things that are really more self-directed. I think the role of the psychiatrist is going to have to change just because of the shortage, from being the person doing the bread and butter prescribing medications to more of a supervisory role, where perhaps they're working with a team of psychiatric nurse practitioners who are meeting with patients every day, and then perhaps tapping in that psychiatrist when there are cases where folks just aren't getting better or are particularly medically complex. So I think we're at a time that actually the system can't afford to take the few psychiatrists that we have and just kind of treat them the way we've always treated them. My hope is that psychiatrists will be used more at a systems level to design systems of care, and use that expertise to help almost decide who is sick enough to be at the highest level, who can be managed more at that middle tier, and what kind of resources we can put out to the general public to help folks who are just going through some life hurdles, but perhaps not needing full-blown hospitalization. So
no, very insightful. And yeah, I like what you're saying. It's going to have to be broken out in these different kind of layers to really address the shortage of physicians that we have. One other thing I wanted just to get, your thoughts about Dr. Jackson is, how do you really kind of stay up to date with everything that's going on? I know the world of psychiatry is always evolving. Are there any things that you would give as tips to our listeners that you like to do personally?
Yeah, so I'm a millennial, so I embrace the podcast, the YouTube channels. I think I've just seen an outburst of certified mental health professionals who are putting up their shingle on YouTube. I'm not a big TikToker, but I hear that there's some out there. I would urge people to really check out the folks who are verified as certified professionals. And really, there's a lot of what we call psychoeducation that's out there for free. So I like to keep a pulse on that. But of course, there are the professional organizations that I think are still very relevant in helping us keep track of all the key scientific findings. But I try to make sure I'm balancing those expert sort of high level opinions with reading the New York Times, which, for example, just put out an article about a new drug for postpartum depression. So I'm trying to not just read the expert opinions, but I want to know what normal people are reporting up and what they're asking questions about, because I think we should be able to communicate on all those levels with our patients.
Love bringing in all the platforms. That's really, that's smart. I love that. Ryan, I'd love to give some advice to some potential, psychiatric residents about, what they should be mindful of going into the job market, and, what potentially working with somebody like you could do and assist them in that search.
Absolutely. First thing I would say is it's never too early to start looking. I would give yourself at least a year. Once you find the right one, it's going to come to fruition pretty quickly. But I would highly recommend starting your job search early, putting feelers out there. But also be transparent with yourself as well as your recruiter or the people you're working with on your timeline and your expectations and your processes, because we are fighting an uphill battle here from all three sides, from the recruitment side, from the hospital side, the organization side, and as well as the physician side. So work together, collaborate with them, and definitely I would recommend finding a good recruiter. Not all recruiters are created equal. Sorry, but they're not. Find somebody who is going to be, again, transparent with you and who will act as your advocate as much as they're going to act as their client's advocate. I think a lot of people have the misconception of recruiters being your typical salesperson, like a used car salesman. You go in, you say you want to look at some Ford F-150s, and they say, "Come look at this Dodge Dart," and you're like, "That's not what we talked about, right?" So it's very similar, trying to break that stigma and that negative connotation that we have by truly being happy for providers, whether they work with us or a different firm or a different recruiter, take our job or take a different job. Having that mindset and that service mindset, that genuine curiosity to help people is what a good recruiter is going to look like. So I think something they should look for in terms of the job market is, again, transparency. If the system can't be transparent on how you're going to get paid, what you're getting paid, what the breakdown is going to look like, what your responsibilities look like, what their strategic initiatives look like in growth and scaling over the next couple of years, opening new hospital wings, hiring PMHMPs underneath you. If they can't be transparent with you on all of that stuff, it might be a little bit of a red flag. Either they don't have it or they're not willing to share it, which often speaks to their culture. You can always look at leapfrog ratings. Leapfrog ratings are a great way to look into a hospital system to see where they stand in patient care, continuity, patient access. Asking those difficult questions that you might be afraid to hear the answer to, and they might be of disservice to you, but you want to know them up front. Otherwise, it's going to bite you in the butt on the back end. But I think that answers your question. I've got a lot more that I could say, but yeah, those are my tips and tricks.
I think that's super helpful. And hopefully, our listeners will really hear your advice on some of those things that are important when they're getting into the market. Anything else, you guys have noticed just in terms of the areas that you're working, Ryan, you probably see this more. Is there more demand, obviously, in certain areas versus others? And I think Dr. Jackson, you're talking about your new role is an area that really needs, someone like you, and they're so lucky to have you. So just tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I want to give kudos to Ryan. I have to, because I came to him and I fully identified as a community psychiatrist, and I've ended up at a private hospital that works very closely with community. And so I would say my advice to anyone who's beginning their search is to be crystal clear about who you are inside and what drives you and what you're looking for, but balance that with an open-mindedness. And as Ryan said, finding the right recruiter to work with is absolutely game-changing. There were times in the search where I would say, well, what about this? And Ryan would say, he would just remind me of the values that I shared with him in the beginning. And I just thought it was so helpful to keep me focused on the end goals that I had laid out. Because the fact is, there's a lot of places that will hire a psychiatrist right now. So we're lucky that it is sort of the market of the psychiatrist to set the terms, but that can be a double-edged sword if you don't really know yourself and you're not focused in on what you want and what will make you happy. So recruiters really can be that help that you need.
No doubt. Thank you. Yeah, just conversely on that, you got to be true with your candidates too. You got to listen to them. What is important to them, because it's going to be the same old adage. If you try to sell them on something that's not good for them and take that emotional piece, like, oh, for Dr. Jackson, for example, this California dream they wanted to entertain coming from Chicago. I'm like, listen, you got these goals. It's not going to happen if you go to California here. If you want to be in California, you got reason to be, that's great. I'll help you get there. But based on what you told me, this isn't it, Dr. Jackson. So, just challenging perspective at times, I think, is really important. It's kind of like having good friends around you. You don't want to be the friend where when somebody comes to complain to you or, complain about something that consistently happens in their life, you just, oh yeah, agree with them, bet with them. No, that's not being a good friend. It's saying, hey, I think you should try this, or have you thought about it this way? It's challenging perspective. And when you can ask those tough questions, not only with your friends, but in your professional life as well, I think you're going to see yourself go a lot farther and be able to help a lot more people. As far as big trends we currently see, all of them, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. Unfortunately, our healthcare system is a little bit flawed. But I think, a few years ago, radiology wasn't even at the top of the list. And I think the last couple of years, it's been number one or number two. We're going to see that with psychiatry. It's one of those industries where it's a little too late. It's when they need the help, they need it now. And we should have been thinking about it 3, 4, or 5 years ago. And kind of, we can't see the future, but trying to be a visionary at least. But I guarantee you psychiatry is going to become the number one need within the next 5 years, if not sooner. But everywhere is crucial. I mean, I see these small anesthesiology groups getting swallowed up by big corporations right now, and every single one of them can't hire or retain someone to save their life because CRNAs are in such high demand right now. They can go work per diem or locum tenens and travel the country, make $200,000 more than they're going to make in a permanent role, and experience life. So then the anesthesiologists are start covering all of these shifts. The culture and the continuity of the system stinks. They're burnt out. They end up leaving, and it's just this massive exchange of stress, kind of a mass state of psychosis like we experienced in COVID. So, but no, there's trends everywhere, but psychiatry is at the top of my list, that it means a lot to me. But anytime that you can find a stellar provider and put them in a place that's not only conducive for the community, but conducive for them, their family, and their goals, that's when you really get to make a difference. And that's what I'm most excited about.
Well, thank you so much. I want to thank Dr. Jackson, for being on today, and Ryan for all of your insight, all of your time. This is such an important topic and such an important role that you play in our communities. And I'm just so glad that Ryan and you were able to work together, and you're really loving your new role. So I'm really, really excited. Thank you guys both for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Stacy. Thanks, Dr. Jackson.
Thank you so much. Great to see you.
Thank you to all of our listeners. If you would like to be notified when new episodes air, make sure to hit that subscribe button. And a big thank you to Pacific Companies. Without you guys, this podcast would not be possible. If you would like to be a guest, please go to www.pacificcompanies.com. Thank you.